Hello, S.E. Whitmore School U.S. History students. I'm Mr. Cannon, and in this unit, we're going to be looking at the foundations of American republicanism, a new nation. We're going to be looking at the beginning of our country, how we founded the republic, what that actually is going to look like. We've seen the Constitution and what kind of government and what kind of country the Constitution is going to set up. But now we have to actually look like what did that mean in the real world? What did that actually look like? And of course, we're going to be looking at it through the lens of our first presidential administration was George Washington's presidency. And you can see George Washington there on the right. You can see Thomas Jefferson on the left, and then that's Alexander Hamilton. Some of you may be familiar with a little bit of this just from the famous musical Hamilton. There are some accurate things about that, and there are some things that are not quite so accurate. But we're going to try to dig into the first presidential administration and how it's going to set the stage for the future of the country and the future of the republic and what that republic actually looked like. You know, the founders had a vision for what it would look like, but then how did that actually play out? Obviously, it's going to be way more successful. It's going to be successful as opposed to the Articles of Confederation, which we saw were not successful. But the Constitution is successful and our republic is successful, and it still goes on today. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this unit. So our unit skill is contextualization. Now, what that means is when we contextualize something, we try to put it in its proper place and perspective for that time period. So I gave an example here. If I see this image, how do I contextualize this image? Well, in other words, I have to put myself as what was this image trying to show me? Well, obviously, this is the image of a school. And if I had no idea what else was going on, I would know this is some kind of problem going on. Although the adults don't look very scared here, they look like the adults look like they're, laughing and just doing what they're supposed to be doing. But you can see the students here are bent down, they're facing the wall. Now, because we all have some knowledge of schools, we actually know that this is some kind of drill. And in this case, this would have been a tornado drill. Now, I'm able to contextualize this image because of other knowledge that I have the time period. Other knowledge that I have as being a student in a school. I was once a student in school and I did a drill just like this. So it was easy for me to contextualize that. But if we're trying to contextualize something that we're not as familiar with, that maybe we haven't experienced, we have to go back to the time period and look at other things to try to give that context. Now, here, like I said, very easy. I was a student in a school. I know these students are doing a tornado drill. And what that also tells me is that this is a school in an area that gets tornadoes. Obviously, if this is a school in an area in the desert that never gets tornadoes, they're likely not doing tornado drills. But in an area like South Carolina, but especially in an area like Alabama or Kentucky or out in the Midwest, an area like Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, where they get big, large tornadoes, even bigger than we generally get here, this would be a drill that they would have to do. So we can contextualize the video and say, or the image here and say, this had to be from a school that has tornadoes. And so they're doing some kind of tornado drill. The same would be true for anything in history. We want to take whether it's an image or a speech or a primary source or whatever later in history, a video, when video finally comes into play, we want to be able to contextualize that for that time period. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this unit. Now, what are we actually going to be contextualizing? Well, we're actually going to try to contextualize George Washington's farewell address at the end of his presidency. So when Washington leaves the presidency, he serves two terms. The terms are 4 years each, so he served 8 years as president. He didn't have to just serve two terms. He decided on his own to just serve two terms, and that actually is going to set the stage for other presidents in the future to do the same thing, to only serve two terms. Now, today, that actually is a part of our Constitution. You can only serve two terms as president. But back then, that's just something Washington decided to do on his own. which is why some people think Washington's such a great president. One of the reasons is because he had all this power and he willingly gave it up. But at the end of his second term, when he knew he wasn't going to be president anymore, he gave a speech. He wrote out the speech, and in the speech, he's going to detail some important issues that he believes the country needs to address, that the country is going to go through. Now, this is not the entire speech. The speech is much longer than this, but this is an excerpt of the speech. And in this excerpt, we're going to be looking at that, and you're going to try to contextualize it and figure out what is Washington actually talking about here? And of course, the lessons in this unit are going to help you to do so because you're going to learn about things going on around George Washington's presidency, which will help you contextualize that. But you're going to read this excerpt and you're going to answer some questions about it. Now, just to give you an example here, I'll go through some of the key phrases here. He says in the very first part of the excerpt that I gave you here, he says, I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. So what he's talking about is the dangers of parties. He's talking about political parties. So the context would be George Washington sees these political parties emerging in the country. He was not himself a part of a political party, but he sees them emerging, and that's why uh, Hamilton and Jefferson were on the first slide because they're going to be sort of the faces of the first two parties. He's warning here of the dangers of those parties. And he says, particularly when the parties are based on geographical discriminations. In other words, you have a party that's based primarily in one region of America, and the other party is primarily based in another region of America. By the way, this is similar to what we're dealing with even today. We see that even though there are plenty of liberal Democrats in the South primarily is conservative, and they generally vote conservative and Republican. Whereas in the northeastern areas of the state and out west and places like California, we see it more liberal and more Democratic. There are plenty of Republicans in those places, but the majority of people are Democrat and liberal. And so they sort of run those areas, and Republicans run most of the South. Not all, but they run most of it. So that's what Washington's talking about here. He's saying that that's dangerous to have that. And so we'll go on. I'll skip the second paragraph. You're going to have to read that though. But he says the alternate domination of one faction over another. Faction is one group, a separate group. So the domination of one group over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension. So political parties having dissension, political parties dividing people. He says one faction, one group can actually, when they take power, use that power as revenge over the other. Do we see that in America even today? You'll have to decide that, but I think there's some truth here. We see that when one group gets into power, they often will try to lord it over another group as a part of revenge. And he says, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities. He says, in history, in other words, when we see this happen, it's not good. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. In other words, then what the parties do is they look to one person to lead them. And that person they give a lot of power to. He's talking about the presidency here, especially the presidency. He's worried that as the parties emerge, that they'll all power in one person to achieve their ends, whatever those ends are. And then he says, and sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. He says, then that person who's been given all this power doesn't really care about the party anymore. He turns to his own elevation. He elevates himself or herself and does their own what they want to do. Without looking forward to the extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, The common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. So he says a wise people ought to lessen the importance of political parties and factions in America. And you can go on and read the rest of it. You will have to read the rest of it. But what Washington's talking about here, the context here is parties are emerging, and he's warning of the dangers of them. And as you go through the unit, you're going to see that those parties, there is a danger there. Now, political parties were inevitable. How divided America was going to be was something Washington was seeing in the future. He was warning against it. And obviously, get today, let's just go back in history, those parties, we're going to see political parties and factions, we're going to have a civil war part of it. Now, the Civil War, of course, is revolved around the issue of slavery, but parties emerged over the issue of slavery as well. And we'll talk about that in another unit. Anyway, this is the excerpt you're going to be reading, and ultimately what you're going to be doing is on the next slide. So what you're going to be doing with the excerpt is you're going to answer these questions. So I have 6 questions for you to answer, and this is how your project is going to be graded for this unit. You're going to answer these questions. Open-ended. They're not one sentence answers. Most of them are several, 3, 4, 5, 6 sentence answers. Okay? So just go through the questions real quick. What was going on at the end of Washington's presidency that caused him to warn Americans about the dangers of political parties? Think Jefferson and Hamilton. I sort of already have given you that one. But give me details there. Give me details. Washington says in the 4th paragraph that it was the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. He was referring to political parties. What reason did he give for discouraging and restraining them? Do you think he was right? Why or why not? Would be your opinion, but you got to give evidence to back your opinion. You have to explain your opinion, not just say, I agree or disagree. Why do you agree or disagree? Third, in the 5th paragraph, the next to last paragraph, Washington says political parties have certain effects on the community. What are they, according to him? 4, at the end of the speech, Washington compared political parties to a fire. How did he say they were similar? 5, what are some of the disagreements Hamilton and Jefferson had about the future of America that led to the forming of political parties? That's what you'll learn about in the unit. And 6, explain in a paragraph whether you think Washington was correct about avoiding political parties. Give evidence from the speech and from current political parties to support your answers. So, guys, the last question is more than 3 or 4 sentences. That's a paragraph. Or 2 if you need to go into 2. So, 5, 6 sentences at least, do that. But I want you to explain. The biggest issue is not the amount that you write, but you need to explain whether he was correct about avoiding political parties. And you got to give evidence from the primary source that we used, his speech, and from current political parties. So give evidence about what's going on now to support your answer. The answer is not necessarily the political parties are bad. I can go both ways on that. I can argue both ways. But I want you to think about it and think about, do you think that they go too far, or do you think that the political parties are just a good part of America and we need them? All right. If you have any questions, reach out to your teacher. Some of you have me, Mr. Cannon. If you have another teacher, reach out to that teacher, please. And good luck with this. I know you're going to do a great job.